With Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793, slavery was reinvigorated. The South now supplied more than half of the world's cotton, which left many European countries like Britain dependent on their crop. But the South's one-crop economy left them at the mercy of world conditions, watching as the industrialized North gained wealth. Slavery had created a pseudo-aristocracy in America, which served to perpetuate the peculiar institution. By the 1830s, abolitionism really took off as the Second Great Awakening swept through the country, inspiring people like Theodore Dwight Weld and William Lloyd Garrison to begin spreading their message. The publishing of these ideals began to truly define the growing rift between North and South, as those who served to make a profit off of the slave system began silencing the abolitionist voices coming from the North, asserting that the Northern wage slaves lived in far worse conditions than the slaves of the South, who were literally valuable. Interestingly enough, the first cries for secession came from the North, as extreme followers of Garrison believed the root of the slavery issue lay in the Constitution itself, which neither provided for or against slavery. With President William Henry Harrison's election in 1840, puppet masters Henry Clay and Daniel Webster planned to control the White House, but the carpet was ripped out from under them when Harrison died only 4 weeks later, leaving the Democratic-leaning John Tyler in control of the country. As the 1840s drew on and James K. Polk entered the White House, the nation's attention turned to the acquisition of Texas and California without going to war with Mexico. Despite numerous offers to purchase the desired territory, manifest destiny too strongly gripped the president's mind, causing the U.S. to force a showdown. The Mexican War proved to be practice for the Civil War, as generals like Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant gained invaluable battle experience. All in all, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, the U.S. only had to pay Mexico $15 million for all of the Mexican territory from Texas to California. With the Mexican cession, the thorny issue of slavery in the territories was once again at the forefront of American politics. The South was very well off politically by 1850. Zachary Taylor, a Southerner, was president. They held the majority in both the cabinet and the Supreme Court, and equality had been maintained in the Senate. But this delicate equilibrium might easily be interrupted by the Mexican cession. With the stakes this high, the three giants, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and Daniel Webster, met for the last time to try and construct a solution to pacify the mounting tensions within the country. Their efforts culminated in the Compromise of 1850, which admitted California as a free state, banned the slave trade in the District of Columbia, instituted popular sovereignty in the Mexican cession lands, and handed down a stricter fugitive slave law. Even though the North came out on top in this compromise, Northerners were infuriated by the fugitive slave law, vowing never to enforce it. The 1850s also saw manifest destiny truly manifest itself in the opening of trade with China and Japan and the beginnings of the Transcontinental Railroad. The railroad began to cause significant problems when Senator Stephen Douglas proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act to organize the Kansas and Nebraska territories so as to make them a viable route for the railroad. With the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Missouri Compromise was repealed, as it provided for the people of the territories to vote on whether or not slavery was to be allowed there. This proved once and for all that no compromise would be able to mend the nation when it came to the divisive issue of slavery. With the publishing of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, and Hinton R. Helper's The Impending Crisis of the South in 1857, the fire of change began to blaze brightly in the North, and with John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, the slavery issue turned violent. In effect, the events of Bleeding Kansas were some of the first shots of the Civil War. These passions spilled into Congress, as evidenced by Congressman Preston Brooks' caning of Senator Charles Sumner over one of his blazing anti-slavery speeches. Then, in 1857, the Dred Scott decision struck a devastating blow for the abolitionist cause, as the Supreme Court concluded that the Missouri Compromise had been illegal all along, meaning that slavery was free to seep into the territories. But the tides would soon turn, as Abraham Lincoln stepped onto the political stage in a series of famous debates with Senator Douglas. Although he did not win the race for Senate, the 1860 presidential election would be his. But with his election, the South finally made good on their many threats of secession, with South Carolina leading the exodus. Despite common belief, Lincoln's immediate goal in the beginnings of the Civil War was not to abolish slavery, but rather to preserve the Union, with or without it. As the South fired the first shots of the Battle of Fort Sumter, Lincoln could declare the Confederate States of America in revolt, giving him the higher ground. Thousands of volunteers streamed in, ready to defend the Union. While the South did have superior military skill, it was handicapped by its lack of factories and manufactured goods. As the war dragged on, the Confederacy found itself without shoes, proper clothing, or enough food. The South was dependent on European intervention in the war, but it never came, as the working-class majority in Europe were almost exclusively anti-slavery, and European leaders were afraid of the food shortages that would ensue if they were to cut off relations with the North. Another advantage Lincoln had over Davis was that he had the luxury of controlling an organized and well-established government, which allowed him to make a few tyrannical decisions that were crucial to the later Union victory. With the Confederate victory at the Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, the Union was able to buckle down and prepare for what they now realized would be a long and hard struggle. A total war plan was soon drawn up. Essentially, the North aimed to suffocate the South through an oceanic blockade, free the slaves to undermine the South's very economic foundations, cut the Confederacy in half by seizing control of the Mississippi River, chop the Confederacy into pieces by marching through Georgia and the Carolinas, capture the capital of Richmond, Virginia, and try everywhere to engage the enemy's main strength and grind it into submission. With McClellan's victory at Antietam after happening upon a copy of Lee's battle plans, Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863. A key quirk to the document was that it only freed slaves in the states that were in revolt, meaning that slavery in the delicate border states would be left alone. So Lincoln freed slaves where he couldn't, and wouldn't where he could, leaving many Northerners upset by his essentially inconsequential actions. But the Emancipation Proclamation held huge ramifications for the South, as it gave the Union added moral strength, as evidenced by the series of Union victories following its announcement. The Southern cause was doomed, and in April of 1865, Lee formally surrendered. Now the nation faced the real test of how to go about Reconstruction. Lincoln's assassination just weeks after the end of the war sent shockwaves through the nation, but it held devastating ramifications for the South. Lincoln had developed a plan for Reconstruction even before the war ended, and his desire for a quick and easy transition is seen in his lenient 10% plan. But with his death, a voice of reason was lost, and radical Republicans were interested in making sure the South paid before re-entering the Union. Furthermore, the issue of what to do with the thousands of newly freed slaves added to the mess of federal problems. The Freedmen's Bureau was established in 1865. While not as effective as it could have been, it taught approximately 200,000 blacks how to read, thus providing them with a crucial skill in order to hopefully integrate into society. Despite these efforts to provide a peaceful transition, ardent racism was still rampant within the healing nation, as seen by President Johnson's veto of the renewal of the Freedmen's Bureau and the introduction of black codes in the South, aimed at keeping the freed blacks in the area so as not to lose the cheap labor. Despite the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, while blacks were no longer slaves on paper, their lives were not very different. In fact, white supremacy sentiments became heightened, as seen by the creation of the Invisible Empire of the South, the KKK. Even though slavery had been officially eradicated from the country, it would be an additional 100 years before African Americans could enjoy true equality.